This video is brought to you by Nebula, where you can get access to my exclusive companion video that covers 2 more weird games that I played. The never-ending backlog is something I quite foolishly continue to add to. When a good thing happens, I buy a game to celebrate. Then, when a bad thing happens, I buy a game to treat myself. And when nothing happens, I still find myself buying a game anyway. In search of my video treats, I often like to hunt down the oddballs in gaming history, and I've ended up with quite a number of strange titles on my shelf. So, in an effort to subdue the guilt I feel every time I buy a new game instead of finishing one I already own, I made the excuse that I can just make a video detailing my experience with the weirdest games in my backlog. All of the ones I've selected for today are on PlayStation platforms ranging from different generations, and while some do attempt to be a video game, others are more of an interactive experience. With the latter in mind, let's begin with the first title, Gabalscreen. Intrigued by the cover art of this PS1 game, and armed with the sole knowledge that you play as a shoe, I popped the disc into my PlayStation and eagerly awaited whatever I was going to see past the boot screen. The intro shows Japanese musician and producer Tetsuya Komuro toiling away in his studio before taking a brief break to open a gift he received from a fan. Inside the neatly wrapped box is a pair of sneakers, and Tetsuya gets back to work before showing off his sick basketball moves and leaving the room. Shortly after, one of the sneakers comes to life as if possessed by the mind of a fan, desperately trying to find the new music their idol was working on and seemingly breaking the device in the process. A bunch of CDs shoot out from the monitor and go on an excursion around the room, finally returning from whence they came with the off-brand low-top Converse following quickly behind them. Released in 1996, Gabalscreen is more of a kind of interactable music software. There aren't any game over screens, and it's closest in definition to a walking sim, perhaps even more appropriate since you are literally a singular sneaker. However, traversal doesn't technically involve walking, which you might expect when playing as a shoe. Instead, your sentient footwear entity maneuvers by hovering through the air. The controls are very simple, and you essentially just fly around the themed levels, interacting with various objects in the environment. These will prompt short scenes. For example, building a house out of toy blocks only for a giant baby to knock it all down, laughing as it destroys your hopes and dreams. Or perhaps finding eggs that hatch small chicks that break open a large shell to reveal Fat Chocobo. While many of these events are optional, there are a couple specific things you will have to investigate in each stage that will grant you a CD or 2. Normally, what you should engage with is something that stands out in some way, like how a room full of resting eyes will be awoken by ringing the nearby alarm clock, and completing the area involves finding both the red-coloured eye and the one that still remains closed. Once you've collected all the available discs in a world, you have the option to be transported to the next, basically accumulating these different CDs that represent various instruments until you've formed the entirety of a song. There are 7 tracks in total, and completing them not only plays the full version for you to hear, but you get to witness a live-action music video that incorporates the imagery and sounds you've encountered in the worlds you pilfered for inspiration. Like how the seaside stages build up to a video taking place on a beach with a clown and a Ferris wheel making an appearance. Many of the locations in Gabalscreen are surprisingly quaint, and although they obviously had little to offer in the gameplay department, observing these bizarre yet peaceful scenes was satisfying enough for me. It also helps that at a press of a button, you could hide the shoe and any UI on screen to let you really absorb the scenery, or in my case, take a bunch of screenshots. Like a lot of people, I am a sucker for the PS1 aesthetic, and I was truly in my elements riding the Ferris wheel and watching the view of the sea roll past as gentle music and the sound of the waves bristled in my ears. The environments occasionally had a slightly liminal air to them, but others also reminded me of PS1 tech demos, the Manta Ray one in particular. The manual says that it wants the player to enjoy the virtual worlds as if taking a leisurely stroll on your musical treasure hunt, and for as odd as Gabalscreen is, it definitely succeeded in its goal. Next up is a game that I found while searching for Japan-exclusive pet sims, and while it's not exactly what I had in mind, DogStation did end up being more unique than I thought it would be. I'd summarise the gameplay as a combination of Nintendogs and WarioWare, where you first choose a puppy you'd like to adopt and give it a name. Then you enter a mini-game rush until the dog becomes an adult. I think I named my Shiba Inu Roy by accident as I fumbled through the introductory screens. And there are several other breeds available which are all really cute and reminded me of the Nintendogs intro. The dog models are adorable and in a similar vein of what you'd see in Nintendogs, which came out a couple years later. The only odd thing I noticed was the breathing animation where Roy's chest looked like a waterbed. But otherwise, I grew to love the little guy. The mini-games you play don't all rely on being able to read Japanese, and I managed to get by with my very minimal knowledge and some luck. Some will just require you to spell out the word or phrase displayed on screen, which is made a lot easier since the character you need to pick next is highlighted yellow. Or maybe even just pressing a single button that appears on screen in the case of jump rope. Others will require you to choose an answer from a few options. For example, the tug-of-war scenario, which I somehow won from selecting options at random. However, failure isn't really a huge loss, since your puppy will still slightly grow afterwards. There are different stats that are affected depending on what game you played and how well you did. But I knew I was hopeless and just accepted whatever increase I got. Another thing that I quickly realised was that I was too scared to quit and lose progress until Roy was fully grown, barely giving me a moment of respite before throwing up a selection of games to play next. There were typical grooming and bonding ones where you clip the dog's nails, bathe them, or have them catch a frisbee. You can even choose what meal to feed them, and then keep your eye on the bowl it's been hidden in and select the correct option. But if you choose the wrong one, then your pet seemingly doesn't get to eat. Huh, that's weird. Now that I mention it, some of the minigames are quite strange. Like how one involves keeping away an onslaught of bugs and mice targeting your sleeping puppy. Or another that has you desperately calling out to your dog to help it cross the road, with a truck in the distance that gets closer and closer, heading straight for your furry friend. I scrambled, picking my random Japanese words and phrases and spelling them out in a frenzy to save Roy from the threat of being run over before finally, he made it to the other side. I sighed out of relief, taking a moment to recover from the stress I had just endured, but nope, back into another minigame. Keeping these scenarios varied, I guess meant that they'd include some pretty wild sequences. I mean, even the potty training had me panicking as I tried to get Roy to reach the newspaper laid out on the floor before he released his demons. You do come across other dogs in the form of rivals, whereby you receive challenges from a roster of other puppies that you are encouraged to beat in a minigame. If you lose, you just go up against them again when the next challenge event pops up. But if you win, you get to take their collar or accessory that they're wearing and move on to the next challenger in line. I didn't beat all of them since there was one racing minigame I kept getting that I just could not complete fast enough to win. But that's okay, because with me as an owner, my poor boy was doomed from the start to a life of failure. So there I was, playing minigame after minigame for an hour until Roy finally graduated to a big boy. Underneath large red text reading "Congratulations," there was a message that said that Roy has grown up to be a father. It felt like we missed a few chapters of Roy's life after that last minigame, but then I remembered that it's actually possible to breed dogs. Curious to see how this worked in-game, I jumped back into the main mode, chose a new puppy, and raised her into adulthood. Then, after using the coupling feature, I was given a choice of mixed breed puppies sharing different features of their parents. You can save these to your memory card and raise those in the main game too, so you can endlessly play minigames with generations upon generations of dogs. I had a little dig into the old site for DogStation and found that it's apparently possible to get a puppy with a rare fur pattern. For example, it could resemble a panda. I'm not sure what the probability is for these rare colours or how many there are in total, but in a way, I guess it's like a shiny Pokemon. Now, aside from the story mode, there are others where you can communicate with your pets using your voice. According to an old IGN article, DogStation requires a particular microphone which is different from others that were standard on the PS2 hardware. But luckily for me, I got a boxed version that includes both the game and the mic. Or so I thought. Unfortunately, the mic that came in my copy was quite literally disintegrating and left crusty sponge crumbs all over my desk, so I had to carefully hold it in front of me as I spoke into it. Obviously, I didn't get very far speaking Japanese, but apparently you're able to recite commands and phrases to improve its stats. And I also read that if you speak coldly to your dog, that it could even run away. So it was a good thing I left it at that, in case I accidentally told Roy to leave and never come back. There's also a tale mode where you can unlock items and clothes by completing certain tasks. It's possible to get 2 new dog breeds as well, that being the Shih Tzu and German Shepherd. But that could take a while as it involves needing to raise 8 different dog breeds to adulthood and completing all challenges on the map for the German Shepherd specifically. The most interesting thing about DogStation though is that the series started with an arcade title, and for the release of the PS2 game, a deluxe edition of the cabinet was made. This allowed you to take the puppies you own to the arcade on your memory card, then slot it into the machine and play with them there. You could also acquire new dog breeds and bring those home too, which is genuinely a really cool concept for this arcade pet sim. However, I found that this wasn't the only dog-themed cabinet in existence, as I stumbled upon a photo of the slightly cursed Walk the Dog game by Sega. Overall, I thought the format of this title was extremely enjoyable, and it's even possible to have a second player join in on the fun, as shown by the large arcadey prompt in the top right corner of the screen. Along with a controller and voice inputs, you can also use a suitable Japanese keyboard, which is a much help to me, but would probably be the quicker option for those who know the language. One last thing about the game that I think really stands out is its presentation. The user interface is very minimalist and stylish, mostly opting for an infinite white background with key objects dotted around. Given that there's a good bit of text on screen almost always, it keeps it from being too cluttered while also building a really distinctive visual style. Even the credits are satisfying, with the rainbow confetti decorating an otherwise neutral palette, allowing good old Roy to be the adorable focus as the names of the developers roll by. The concept of virtual museums is something that I have a certain fondness for, and Space MOSA, or the Space Museum of Southern Art, is a pretty compelling take on this idea. It documents the history of the Japanese band Southern All-Stars from its inception up to around December 1999, when this PS1 experience was released as a 20th anniversary celebration. The neon green packaging for Space MOSA is giving Men in Black with a weird naked chrome alien being detained. And if that wasn't enough, there's also a whole army of them on the back, with one wearing a t-shirt that says, "Ellie, my love so fat." The discs and manual also share a fitting sci-fi themed style, and there's even a part in the manual you can cut out to make your own Special Agent ID card. There's also a pre-order bonus disc for Windows that of course was missing from the copy I bought, but from what I could gather, it looks to just have a collection of screensavers and wallpapers. The intro for the game is even more outlandish than the packaging, if you'd believe it, and I think it's best I just let you watch it without any commentary.
薪これで終わりなんですけどこれだけもうダメだお母ちゃん落ち着け
Anyway, Space MOSA is structured into separate discs, segmenting the space station the game is set on into 3 main facilities comprising of the museum, library, and theatre. I didn't know anything about the band before playing this, but I was shocked by how much stuff they put into this thing. Not only did they have 221 songs with their album covers and lyrics, but also the props they used in photo shoots and music videos, in addition to tour passes throughout the years. There are so many Polaroids, handwritten notes, scans of vinyls, and even ceramic figures and merch that they photographed using different angles. The word museum really is fitting. Speaking of merch, there's also a gift shop on the space station which sells Space Mosa themed souvenirs, which I found actually does exist in the real world too. For example, this includes a t-shirt, frisbee, and pin badges. The kiosk area kind of acts like a shopping magazine, but showcased in a virtual world. And to be fair, whenever I visit a museum, my favourite part is going to the gift shop at the end. So it was unique to have that translated into a ludic format, since that's part of museum experiences that doesn't tend to have a reason to exist in a game context. I was overwhelmed by the amount of objects in the various exhibits, and the space station environment was already pretty intriguing to explore without the context of its displays. There are swaying, futuristic corridors juxtaposed against hallways decorated with tatami mats and traditional sliding doors. Then there's zigzagging walkways and an area that for some reason has an inflatable doll flying around, all containing posters and other memorabilia that you can browse through. My favourite facility was the library, which is a clean white room that reminds me of a non-deadly version of the Nostromo. There are several sub-rooms you can move to, which have brief transitions between them that look so cool, and the art direction for this area in general really stands out to me. Also, one interesting feature within this place is that you can watch a live show performed by the band where you can switch freely between different cameras, which I imagine is something that fans of Southern All-Stars would enjoy, in addition to the 25-minute or so video clip medley that you can watch in the space station's theatre. In terms of the gameplay, the player takes control of a character in a spacesuit, and you can actually switch between a first-person view and a third-person view should you want to. In the menu, you can also find the option to change the background music that plays as you explore the museum, or if you prefer, you can just go with the ambience of the space station instead. The areas are fairly large, but you can just fast travel between the different zones via the elevators, and the bright orange UI and wireframe map is peak graphic design. Space Mosa is probably the coolest virtual museum I've ever visited, and is packed with detail and efforts that I would not have expected from this kind of title. It's also by far the best way I could have possibly found out about the existence of a Japanese band, so I'm happy I made this discovery. Next up is a PlayStation VR title which, like Space Mosa, is also a 20th anniversary celebration of something, that being a Japan-only PS1 title called Kowloon's Gate, based within a dark sci-fi infused setting inspired by Hong Kong's Kowloon walled city. I've been eyeing up this game since I first saw a copy of it in a random Japanese hardware store a few years ago, and while language barriers don't tend to stop me from playing something myself, Kowloon's Gate's writing is a huge part of the experience, and Google Translate won't be able to accurately convey the more complex concepts of the narrative. Still, with enough research, I could probably piece things together, but I'm also wondering if it's better I wait for an English fan translation to be finished first. I love the Kowloon-style architecture and alleyways in any game, so that's also why I'm very excited for Slitterhead to come out, which shares that same environmental influence. However, I remembered I didn't have to wait until November to experience that kind of setting with an English language option available, because Kowloon's Gate VR Suzaku exists. I did have to jump through a few hoops to play it, as the English version is only purchasable from the Hong Kong PSN store, which meant that I had to create a separate Hong Kong account. After that though, it was smooth sailing, and there's the option to choose between both a VR and non-VR mode. I went for the latter for the sake of convenience, and so I could get footage that wouldn't give you all motion sickness. But also, I am pleased I did, because I could really appreciate the intricacies of the game's world with its cluttered alleyways encased in walls covered with pipes and ventilation fans. In terms of its relation to the original game, it remakes some of its areas in higher fidelity, which you can now move around in real time. In the PS1 title, you could only click to move to different locations, which would have a transitional animation to simulate a sense of real-time movement. So I really appreciate being able to have a new perspective of this fascinating world. According to the old crowdfunding page for the project, it takes place not long before the events of the first game, and you're given access to certain rooms that you couldn't enter before. Since it's a prequel, it could have familiar characters be present in this iteration and introduce some new ones too. The characters' appearances in general is something I've always been so fond of, combining cyberpunk and gothic influences to create these strange and easily recognizable designs that fit its dystopian world. Just being able to walk through these streets makes the Suzaku experience like a short vacation somewhere you visited many years ago. The developers themselves describe this title as a non-game, saying that it's an unconventional gaming experience and their main aim was to simply allow players to enjoy the space in a similar manner they would when visiting a theme park. As you play through the campaign missions, you unlock an option called Night Special, which is a free roam mode without any NPCs present, accompanied by some different music. That, by the way, was created by the original Kowloon's Gate composer Kuniaki Haishima. I know that I said this VR experience is labelled as a non-game, but it is closer to a typical game than something like Space Mosa. You do have actual objectives to complete to reach this prequel's conclusion, which usually involve finding a certain object or person to take a psychological photograph of, and these memories are noted in an album with a washed-out image serving as a clue for what you're looking for. The areas you traverse vary in size, as the explorable space grows as you complete missions, perhaps making it possible to open a gate or unblocking a certain path. You'll spend a lot of time walking through the same alleyways over and over, since locating what you need to photograph will often require you to trigger certain events in specific locations, and that can take a fair bit of backtracking. Essentially, you have to keep looking around and seeing if anything happens. And there aren't always clear markers for where you have to go either, so having an appreciation for the world building is a must unless you want to quickly grow bored. That sometimes means checking every door multiple times each mission, and I would always get a little surprise and relief when a previously locked door finally opened or a new character would appear. One memorable part for me was having a large area become accessible, as the constricting alleyways I had been in for some time unraveled into a space where I felt like I could finally breathe again. The way that the virtual space expands was unexpectedly satisfying, but without the in-depth knowledge of the first game's story, I undoubtedly missed a bunch of references and the significance of certain things. For example, there was a door I went through that took me to a strange dark walkway leading to another door, which opens into a dreamlike platform suspended in the sky. I don't know what this means, but the feeling of seeing such a place in contrast to the rest of the game felt incredibly surreal. Speaking of surreal, in order to take psychological photos and unlock new missions, you'll have to use shrimp, more specifically peeled shrimp. These can be found lying around the environments, which is unhygienic, but also has to be the best in-game currency I've ever seen. To finish the game, you'll need to pick up a ton of these, because the cost to unlock levels increases each time and the end stages are fairly expensive. There's also an achievement for having 99 in your inventory, so yes, I did have to do some shrimp grinding. Luckily, you can replay missions and get a max of 20 each run, so it didn't take me too long to fill my pockets with valuable shellfish. Aside from the fantastic intro sequence I showed earlier being a great example of the world's technological design, the majority of the game's UI is displayed via the interfaces of the Kowloon Net fire hydrant devices. You can find several of these dotted throughout the game, and they basically act as a menu and save station but with a suitable visual style. And even though the game language can be set to English, there isn't really much text in the game at all, and you'll still catch the occasional spelling error. Unfortunately, a bulk of the dialogue appears when interacting with a talking puppet, and this text isn't even translated. The possibilities are that they skipped it by accident or left it on purpose, but I can't really tell which one of the two it is. Even though you travel back and forth through the same environments many times, the contents of the halls gradually change, sometimes becoming slightly eerier. And if you don't want any spoilers from this point on, I suggest skipping to the next game on the list, which I'll put the timestamp for up on screen. Quite early on in Suzaku, you'll notice a plethora of missing person posters and TV announcements almost everywhere you look, and you can't help but shake the feeling that you're going to end up on a poster yourself. In the last couple levels, there'll be piles of Polaroid cameras that appear where they don't belong, and another will suddenly only have one type of NPC inhabiting the area as if they've taken over. In the final stage though, things have seemingly returned to normal, but that comfort only lasts for a short while. As you approach the room containing the final photograph subject, a green tripod creature stands up and turns to face you. Its Polaroid camera visage stares at you as you take one last photo. Then plays a sequence reminiscent of the original game's intro, bringing our time with Kowloon's Gates VR to an end. Going back to the PS3, I chose a little game called Datura as my next title. It can either be played using PlayStation Move or just the standard DualShock 3 controller. But for my playthrough, I chose to go with the latter since that was what I had readily available. Much like a few other games on this list, it is a very short experience at around an hour long, though it does differ in that it feels more like a demo of sorts for motion controls. Taking place in a mysterious forest, you explore and interact with things like water fountains and wells. There are also doors you can enter that take you into different environments, which makes even more random motion-controlled actions available. These movements were a little tough with the controller, but with PlayStation Move I assume it's probably smoother. Datura doesn't seem to bother too much in terms of telling a cohesive story, and focuses more on the visuals and sound, with the 3D space acting as more of a playground consisting of separate swings, slides, and other equipment that you can each interact with in a different way. And when I said that it's more of a demo, that's not an entirely unsupported conclusion, as the developers are part of something called the demo scene. I adore the PS3 era, and there's such a surprising amount of unique titles that, to this day, I still discover new strange games I've never heard of. There are actually 2 more demo scene titles I played that aren't typical video games, and their willingness to break free from that standard definition gives rise to some very surreal and unconventional experiences. The demo scene community and art form was incredibly interesting to learn about and even more fun to talk about, something that I do in a companion video which you can find exclusively on Nebula. I go into the demo scene in greater detail and discuss these 2 weird games that also happen to be part of the category. So if you want to watch that and also support me directly, you can use my link to get 40% off annual plans or go for a monthly subscription instead. Nebula is a great platform for me in that I can make more niche video ideas that I have brewing without worrying about getting age restricted and penalised or having to reach a certain video length to appease YouTube's algorithm. There's a lot of freedom for creators on Nebula, and I'll be making even more companion videos and exclusive stuff in the future. Sometimes I'll have tangents in videos that I want to cover separately, but the pressures of YouTube tend to stamp out those ideas. So I really can't stress enough how having this creator-friendly platform is both helping to satisfy and foster my creativity while also being a way to support me. There are so many talented creators who have already made Nebula-only videos and podcasts, as well as full series and documentaries too. Jacob Geller, for example, has a lot of exclusives ranging from discussing the timeless graphical prowess of Arkham Knight to documenting the journey of baking a blackberry peach pie, the latter of which is a personal favourite of mine, and not just because I make an appearance on a t-shirt. There are other gaming creators too, like Rasputin, King K, and Liam Triforce, to name a few. And if you're into podcasts, I'd highly recommend Something Rotten by Blake Hester and Jacob Geller, which dives into the darker and grittier titles of gaming history. It has several Nebula exclusive episodes to indulge in, as well as an episode where I come on as a guest to talk about one of the best games of all time, Silent Hill 3. So to get access to the most interesting streaming platform there is, you can head over to go.nebula.tv/Eurothug4000 and get a yearly Nebula subscription for 40% off or a monthly plan for $6 a month. With that, let's get back to Datura, which opens with the player being transported in an ambulance where, after plucking off your heartbeat sensors, an emergency worker attempts to resuscitate you. The screen goes black, and then shows a quote from the Divine Comedy that reads, "In the middle of our life's walk, I found myself in a dark wood, for the straight road was lost." You then stumble into an autumnal forest, with most of the tree's leaves blanketing the ground beneath you. I searched around for a moment, then headed towards a lone birch tree nearby, my feet crunching against the dead foliage as I awkwardly handled the stiff movement controls. After grabbing the notepad and pencil pinned to the trunk, I was prompted to caress the tree to gain spiritual knowledge of the forest and map my surroundings. There are several other birch trees dotted around the game as well, which will amount to a full sketched out map covering the page. The goal is to pretty much just move through the area and find things to do. And as I said before, there are a lot of different interactions in the environments like lockpicking and even carnival games. But certain objects or doors will transport you into a brand new place, which all seem to band together as a collection of past memories. One of these involves the player sitting in the back of a truck before an inevitable crash, and you have to use a nearby saw to cut through the handcuffs and presumably escape. Another puts the player behind the steering wheel of a vehicle on a dark road, which, like many of the other parts, was not a smooth experience with the controller. It ends with the car swerving away from a pig in the road before the bright flash of oncoming headlights speed into view. There's one scene that will have you gliding down a slide and emerging at a swimming pool where you'll chase some kid around, then slip into the water and possibly hit your head. I can't really tell. There is one character that reappears multiple times. Like after getting pounced on by a weird-looking dog, it then charges after a man with a gun. Later, when you pull a bucket from a well, that same guy pops up and pushes you down, triggering an auditory tunnel light display experience. After that, you're put into the shoes of a child, climbing a tree with a friend and grabbing an apple from a branch. Suddenly, the man bursts through the door and begins shooting. These segments are all very random, and there's no way I could predict what would come next. Like, how could I possibly know a tennis ball machine would lead me into being thrown into the literal trenches? Once all of these main memories are complete, you make your way through the last gate and attempt to climb a nearby ladder. You lose your grip and tumble down before suddenly soaring upwards as if awakening from a dream. And very slowly, a hospital room is pulled into view. Opening the door in front of you, you see a corridor with other children from the swimming pool, the man in the truck, and then the guy in red, who opens a door leading into the bathroom. I made my way to the mirror, wondering what could possibly happen now when I was inexplicably jump-scared by my own PSN profile picture that I forgot I had. Bugs swarmed around this cursed image, and I noticed some text telling me to press the light switch that, for some reason, takes a screenshot of the scene so I could have an everlasting memory of my experience on my PS3, I guess. After this, you have no choice but to turn around, opening the door and stepping foot into the forest once again before the credits finally roll. Usually I can piece together an odd story, but to be honest, I don't really have much solid analysis for what happened. I mean, there's only so much narrative insight I can get from throwing a potato at a pig. Regardless, I have some thoughts floating around, and given the context of everything from the title to the contents, I assume this is some kind of limbo where we experience random parts of someone's life. I can't tell if these memories are all stemming from the same person, but ultimately it seems to all end in the same place. Apparently, you do have some say in how this all plays out. For example, at the ice picking section, you can choose a trophy or a hand to retrieve from the ice. Also, you can save that kid from the guy with the gun, but with my chaotic controller movements, yeah, I don't think so. These subtle changes affect the ending mirror scene where the amount of good choices you make is represented by butterflies, and the bad is illustrated by the beetles. The people in the corridor also change depending on what you did, but you're still going to be met with the view of the forest when you open that final door. It's as though you're looping through life making these choices that affect how you see yourself at the end, but nothing saves you from death. Apart from that, you can see the Datura flower especially near the end next to the forest ladder. They're also hallucinogens, which could explain all the bizarre imagery we've seen throughout. I guess the person we're playing as in the ambulance is dead, but is experiencing their life's memories or even confronting the concept of death in a surreal and psychedelic manner. Overall, the thing that stuck with me most was probably the music. A couple of the tracks are actually really good, and it slightly uplifts the experience, which is an interesting concept with some nice visuals, but was a bit too clunky to control for my liking. I also read that the game has 3D TV support, so that made me wonder if this was mainly a showcase for both that and the PS Move. As I was using neither of these technologies, that may be why the experience fell a bit flat for me, but still, for a demo-type title, it's pretty creative, and I'm glad I got to try it out. I seriously enjoyed going through all of these odd little experiences for this video. And though this isn't a format I tend to do, it was refreshing being able to pack so many games together and give a small spotlight to each of them. There are plenty more titles like these that I have in my collection, so if you do want to see more, please let me know. And also, if there are any weird virtual experiences you know of that you think I'd be interested in, feel free to share them in the comments. I've got a lot of obscure games I'll cover in their own dedicated videos in the future, so if you'd like to stay notified for those, you're welcome to subscribe. I'm pretty excited for what's coming up, and I hope you are too. As always, a huge thank you to my patrons for their support, and thank you for watching.